Dear Dr. Scheller, dear Dr. Blorak, Dr. Würz, Mr. Münch, ladies and gentlemen, today I'm happy to welcome you together with my colleague Liliana Gomez here at the Fridericianum in Kassel for an event which is a cooperation with the Orient Institute Beirut of the Max Weber Foundation, the German War Graves Commission, and the Documenta Institute. We are pleased and happy about this cooperation. It's a premiere because for the first time ever, these initiatives come together and talk about histories and research. El Alamein represents a turning point in the war at the end of the Second World War and was marked as a historical and architectural place of remembrance in the 1950s by the German War Graves Commission with graves. The event tonight aims to address the neglected perspective of Egyptian participation, to bring memorial architecture and the cultural dynamics of shared and dissident lines of remembrance into conversation in a historical and contemporary perspective. The event is thus connected to a number of research initiatives of the Documenta Institute, which is investigating ruptures and Nazi continuities in the art world around Documenta, as well as in a global perspective. The Fridericianum Museum is certainly an adequate place or venue. The Hessian library, where the Brothers Grimm were active, was burnt down in 1943. And the first Documenta, which was intended to mark a cultural new beginning for the young Federal Republic of Germany, was thus all the more significant. And the building was re-erected. I'm very happy to have you here tonight, Professor Hilal, Professor Vormeister, and all the other speakers who are here tonight. We are proud and happy to be your host, and I'm happy to give the floor to the mayor of the city of Kassel, Dr. Scheller. Gentlemen, dear Mr. Münch, dear Mr. Backen, dear Mr. Hoffmann, I'm also very happy to welcome you at the Fridericianum. This is going to be a very interesting panel discussion. But first of all, I would like to tell you a little story. And you will probably see where the connection is. Because I remember a lady who told about her partner who came from Kassel, and she said, "Kassel, it's a beautiful city." Now, this was a conversation with my wife, and she said, well, actually, it's not really a beautiful city. I've been there repeatedly. And then she realized that Grandma had been to Kassel before the war, last time she was here, and the city, which had come into being since then, was very different from what she remembered, the old building in the city center and the old structures. Now, why am I telling you this story? Last week, on 22nd October, we remembered the 81st anniversary of the horrible bombardment of the city of Kassel. On 22nd October 1943, the city of Kassel was almost completely destroyed. The inner city, but also the suburbs, more than 10,000 people died in one night alone. And of course, there was a lot of suffering and misery ever after. There were problems with water supplies and many other things. So this was an emergency situation. And this is an event which is really very much enshrined into the memory of the citizens of the city of Kassel, and it has been an important aspect and item in our remembrance ever since. It was a bomb attack, a bombardment, which was to be seen in the context of World War II, which had been begun by Germany, which had been initiated and led by Germany, and had also major consequences and a major impact on our memories and remembrance after the war, which has an impact still today. If you look back at what the peoples in Europe felt, who were enemies for many centuries and then eventually embarked on this process of a European integration. But in spite of this rapprochement, it has not been possible to avoid wars in Europe. And in spite of all the efforts, we have not managed to have a peaceful solution in the Middle East. But, and this is what I said in the Martin's Church last week, we don't give up our hope. We still hope for a better situation. We want to have the understanding and friendship among the peoples, and the care of German war graves is very important, and the association taking care of the latter has worked hard in the last decades for the benefit of peace. And they are also collaborating with young people and thus really try hard to have former enemies become friends. The memorial in El Alamein, erected in the 1950s by the Volksbund, is an important example to show what important work has been done by this association. The architecture is certainly to be seen in the context of the time. It was erected in 1942. In October, the Second Battle of El Alamein began, and it meant a turning point in World War II. And 1 year later, as I said before, 1 year later, death and destruction were suffered in the city of Kassel. 60 million people had died after World War II, in World War II, and the trauma and the loss is still being felt by the generations of the day. The suffering connects us, and that's what we have to keep remembering. Empathy, the will to achieve reconciliation and the friendship of the peoples. Next year, we'll remember the end of World War II, which was 80 years ago. And we can and we must never forget. History after World War II also showed that former arch enemies can become partners and friends. This is what Europe shows us today after the genocide of Nazi Germany and the murdering of 6 million Jews. A reconciliation between Germans and Jews happened, something people could not imagine earlier. Reconciliation and peace we'd like to see in the Middle East too. We are interested in a peaceful solution in the region, which is also binding us and is an item on the agenda of both our countries. It would be good if in Kassel we'd have a European House of Peace. There are ideas and projects, and there is the intention to do this. The Volksbund has worked hard for the understanding and for friendship of the peoples, and they're based in Kassel, but they require the support from many. So this House of Peace would be a venue for regular events with a regional, supra-regional, and international importance. It would be a house to promote and encourage the culture of memory and remembrance. And this is a task we are seeing for us, and thus we collaborate with the Volksbund. I would like to thank all participants, and I would like to thank Professor Pohl, Professor Hillel, and Professor Fuhrmeister, and I would like to thank the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, the Documenta Institute, the Hessian Agency for Political Education, VHS Kassel, and I hope you will enjoy this fruitful exchange of ideas.
Esteemed Lord Mayor Dr. Scheller, dear Mr. Münch, Mr. Hoffmann, dear Dr. Wirtz, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Stefan Dworok. I'm the Vice Secretary General of the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, the German War Graves Commission. I would like to warmly greet you from our Secretary General, Mr. Backen, who cannot come here today. First of all, I'd like to say thanks. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Hoffmann, our host, for allowing us to hold today's event in this beautiful historical building. I also would like to say, for the German War Graves Commission, for Volksbund, it's a historical place here. We do have photographs dating back to the 1950s, where in a public event, right in front of this building, people were looking for the dead of the Second World War. People who took a VW Käfer to recover the dead in Alamein. I also would like to thank the Orient Institute in Beirut, the Documenta Institute Kassel, and the Hesse State Agency for Civic Education. Thanks for your cooperation today. It is the first event that we have been organizing together in this constellation, and hopefully it's not going to be the last event. The crucial initiative for today's event came from the Orient Institute, and for that, Dr. Wirtz, I would like to thank you once again. Allow me to briefly say a few words about the Volksbund, the German War Graves Commission. It is a humanitarian organization that commemorates the effects of war and violence and calls for peace. with the ongoing search for people killed in the war and the maintenance of around 830 war cemeteries in 46 states, among others in Egypt, in El Alamein. And we are the only ones also that next to that we have a comprehensive youth and educational program, and every year more than 30,000 young people benefit from our program. And we also organize events such as the one we have tonight at Fridericianum. With our series of events, Remembrance Culture in Conversation, we look at history and the remembrance cultures of other countries. El Alamein is a very special place, not only for our organization, not only because of its architecture and because of its important battle of 1940 Day. As Dr. Scholler just said, El Alamein is considered the turning point of the war on the African continent. Since 1953, the dead soldiers had been recovered by the Volksbund from neglected cemeteries and battlefield graves. They were initially provisionally reburied in a cemetery set up by the British, a British cemetery that also took on Germans and Italians. After a war graves agreement was signed with Egypt in 1956, plans were made to find a final resting place. The architect in charge of the project was Robert Tischler. We are going to hear about him later. Between 26 and 1959, that is to say, from the Weimar period right into the Federal Republic of Germany, he was the chief architect of Volksbund, the War Graves Commission. The castles of the dead, the so-called castles of the dead that he built in El Alamein or Tobruk in neighboring Libya remain controversial to this day because of their size. On 28 October 1959, the cemetery in El Alamein was one of the first to be inaugurated after the Second World War. A total of 4,300 people are buried in that cemetery, among them 4,283 German soldiers who fell in the Second World War and 30 soldiers who died in the First World War. And also around 100 soldiers who died in the so-called Battle of Alamein, and 100 soldiers that participated in that battle are still missing today. Our commission was able to recover 2 of them in the desert sands. And every second year we have a ceremony to commemorate the Battle of El Alamein. It's a strong act of reconciliation and joint commemoration of former enemies. We, as the German War Graves Commission, are delighted at this opportunity presented by this special place to highlight aspects of different cultures of remembrance. We will do that when we hear lectures by Professor Hilal, Professor Fuhrmeister, and Professor Pohl. And Professor Pohl, by the way, is also the chairperson of our Scientific Advisory Board. Now I look forward to an exciting presentation by you, Professor Gomez, and I'm especially pleased that you are all here today. Well, that was faster than I thought. Ladies and gentlemen, cooperation partners, official representatives, I'm very pleased to be able to give a welcome address here on behalf of the Hessian State Agency for Civic Education. Examining the war and crimes of the Nazis, commemorating their victims and keeping this memory alive for future generations is and remains an everlasting task and moral obligation of the Federal Republic of Germany and also the state of Hesse. And today I'm speaking on behalf of the state of Hesse. Well, today's topic in the work of our Center for Civic Education and my department on anti-Semitism and right-wing extremism. This topic that we are discussing today is a marginal one. Our main task is to make sure that we network the memorial places in Hesse to support them and to finance them adequately. We support trips to memorials of the National Socialist period for school children predominantly, but any bowling club can apply to us for funding. We bring the remaining survivors of the Holocaust to schools and public events. We support Jewish life in Hesse and beyond. And we also address the more recent Hessian circumstances, in short, Lübcke, Hanau, NSU. Particularly here in this region, in northern Hesse, we have to also work about the current circumstances, but we also commemorate the Second World War. El Alamein is very important for the German and Egyptian culture of remembrance. And this is the topic of our event tonight. In Italy, official commemoration of El Alamein on the part of the Italian government was discussed because all soldiers that have fought for Italy there were called freedom fighters for Italy. But also the is significant for Palestine, the British mandate that became Israel later on, and for Jewish life. This El Alamein memorial is important for Palestine. The El Alamein battle was a fateful battle. I quote, "No, this is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It is perhaps maybe the end of the beginning." This is what Winston Churchill said, the British Prime Minister, after the Brits had stopped Wehrmacht in El Alamein on the 4th of November 1942. Until that very day, everyone who lived in the British mandated Palestine had to be aware of the fact that the German troops could come from the south and would try to kill all Jews living there. Among them Käthe and Ernst Fürst. 8 years before El Alamein took place, they had escaped Germany and settled in Jerusalem. Exactly 9 months after El Alamein, their daughter Edna was born. 79 years later, Dr. Edna Brocker, the niece of Hannah Arendt and the former head of the old synagogue Essen, has published her book, Living in Two Worlds. Edna Brocker says she is part of the El Alamein baby boomer in the British Protectorate of Palestine. And that is also a Jewish, a German, an international perspective on the Second World War. And it is in line with the theme that we're discussing tonight. At the beginning, there was this baby boom in Palestine, a wonderful baby boom. The Wehrmacht was stopped in the desert sand. The Jews in Palestine were relieved, and they were enthusiastic about their future. When Edna started school in Jerusalem in 1949, 5 classes had to be formed. In the years before, it had only ever been one single class. She learned also German from her aunt, Hannah Arendt, and later she has a very special memory of El Alamein and the baby boom that followed El Alamein in Palestine, and she brought that to Germany. And that shows again the German culture of remembrance is multifaceted, and it is international in its own way. For us at the Hesse State Agency for Civic Education, dealing with the past is a central part of our work. Remembering historical events such as the Battle of El Alamein and caring for war graves helps to ensure that the horrors of war will not be forgotten. They offer us the opportunity to learn from history and build bridges of understanding between former enemies. Our task, especially in times of conflict and crisis, this so-called multi-crisis that we are experiencing. It is our task to raise awareness of the importance of peace and international cooperation. Places like El Alamein do not only represent loss and suffering, they also represent hope. Hope that by remembering the past, we will be able to live together in peace in the future. And this was also highlighted by the mayor of Castel, and I also would like to say this is indeed true for Castel, and it is I'm very happy to read in the coalition treaty for the state of Hesse that Castel wants to be a place of peace and wants to also support the plans of the War Graves Commission. We as the Center for Civic Education have been working together for many years with the regional offices of Volksbund, the War Graves Commission in Frankfurt and here. And we'd be happy to implement together with you the plans that you have made. I also would like to extend my heartfelt thanks in advance to the experts we are going to hear tonight and our cooperation partners. It is very good that we are all here tonight, and I wish you all an inspiring event.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Thomas Wirtz, representing the Orient Institute Beirut. I'm happy to thank all cooperation partners and all those who opened our event in memory of El Alamein with a greeting. I'm very pleased that we have this presence and resonance here at the Fridericianum Museum in Kassel. The Orient Institute Beirut has Beirut in its name. Beirut, a city. Now we talk about the dead of El Alamein and also about Kassel, but Beirut is also involved in war and suffering. For 1 month, we have had major activities there. We had to cease our activities, our work there, and those who worked in Beirut had to return to Germany, but our colleagues there who are still in Beirut, who lived there, had to move into the southern part of the city because it's safer. We hope to be able to return to Beirut soon in order to have our events take place there. However, we've always been active in the field of networking, scholarly and humanist activities in Lebanon and in Germany. And we've organized events in Bonn and in Berlin already. But this is our first event in Kassel, and it's high time to have an event here. The idea to have such an event here goes back to the Max Weber Foundation, because the foundation consists of a number of institutes based in Rome, Paris, London, Warsaw, and Washington, but also in Delhi, Tokyo, and other places. And the foundation wanted to benefit from this situation in order to talk about World War II from an international perspective. And that's why today's event is part of the Max Weber Foundation series, The Ends of War, International Perspectives on the Second World War. The idea to have an event dealing with El Alamein is due to the fact that in Lebanon, not much World War II activity was happening. However, there was El Alamein in Egypt, so we've been able to build a bridge. Now, Let's talk about content. And before I introduce our host tonight, Liliana Gomez, I would like to thank the team of the Fridericianum Museum, but also the Volksbund and everybody else who was involved in organizing this event, not least Sophia Anastopoulos of the Documenta Institute. Now, Professor Liliana Gomez, she will be our host tonight. She was a guest fellow at the Orient Institute Beirut 2 years ago. She is a professor of art and society at the University of Kassel, and she's also a member of the Documenta Institute, and she's the director of CELA, which is a Center for Latin American Studies, and she's also in the board of directors of Colors, which is another institute focusing on global research in the humanities. So, Mrs. Gomez, the floor is yours. Good evening. I'm very happy to introduce our esteemed guests and experts for tonight's lecture. They will give presentations, and afterwards we'll have a panel discussion. First of all, I'm happy to welcome Professor Dr. Pohl. He's a professor of contemporary history at the University of Klagenfurt. His research focuses on European and global history from the 1930s to the 1950s. In particular, he focuses on the Nazi era and World War II, German occupation and the Nazi atrocities, the post-war East Germany, and the history of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and Poland in the 20th century. He's currently a spokesperson for the Scientific Advisory Board of the German War Graves Commission, and he has published a lot, and I will just mention 3 important contributions. He's the co-editor of 2 volumes of the edition Der Dienstkalender Heinrich Himmlers, published in 1999 and 2020. He's the co-editor of the 16-volume edition, The Persecution and Murder of European Jews by Nazi Germany 1933 to 1945. Published between 2008 and 2021, and most recently he published the handbook National Socialist Crimes 1939 to 1945. This was published in 2022. Our second guest tonight, and I'm very happy to have him here. He's arrived from Egypt, is Professor Dr. Hillel. He holds the chair of modern and contemporary history at Suez Canal University in Egypt. Prior to that, he taught as a professor of modern and contemporary history at King Faisal University in Saudi Arabia. He has worked as a researcher at the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale du Caire, and is a director of the Documentation and Research Department at the National Archives of Egypt. His main research interests include modern Egyptian political history, colonial history, and social history. He has published internationally in English and Arabic, including, and this is again just some examples, Egypt's Overlooked Contribution to World War II, published in The World in World Wars, Experiences, Perceptions, and Perspectives from Africa and Asia, published in 2010. And then Muhammad Ali's First Army, The Experiment of Building an Entirely Slave Army, published in Race and Slavery in the Middle East, Histories of Trans-Saharan Africans in 19th century Egypt, Sudan, and Ottoman Mediterranean, published in 2010, and published this year an erased experiment penal legislation between 1823 and 1883 in the Oxford Handbook of Modern Egyptian History. And Last but not least, I'm happy to welcome our third guest speaker, Dr. Vormeister, who will join us digitally live today. He received his doctorate in Hamburg with a thesis on material iconography. A traineeship at the Sprengel Museum in Hanover followed, then a position at the LMU Munich. Since 2003, he's been a research associate at the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte, habilitated in 2013 at the LMU Munich, and he has focused on the 19th and 21st centuries and is dedicated to art, architecture, and the history of art history, and including also the transfer of cultural assets, provenance, research, and art in National Socialism. And he has published lots of books, and I would like to mention again some examples. Together with Manfred Hettling, Wolfgang Kruse, and Bernd Ulrich, he published Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, Development and Problems, published in 2019. And also in 2019 published The Department of Art Protection in Italy, Art History, Politics and Propaganda, 1936 to 1963. And together with Kai Kappel, The Building Task of Military Cemeteries and War Graves between 1914 and 1989, War Graves, War Cemeteries and Memorial Shrines as a building task. Mr. Pohl, I'm very happy to welcome you. You will open tonight's debate with your presentation, and afterwards we will hear Professor Heller.
Good evening, dear audience. I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here. In particular, I would like to thank Mrs. Avsestopoulos for the excellent preparation and cooperation with me. It will be my task tonight to give you some background regarding the military history. I have to say that I have come back from 2 events on Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. So we do have a war right in the middle of Europe, and that has lots of repercussions and causes human suffering and tragedies. The war in North Africa, we all know it, at least a little bit, but it's overshadowed by the history of the Second World War and how it is being perceived. Over time, a number of images have developed that focus on specific war theaters. Of course, we know about the Desert War, as you can see, the tank with the dust around it, the icon of the so-called Desert War in North Africa. But we also know about the clash between the Germans and the Brits, the Desert Fox and the Desert Rats, Rommel and Montgomery. Rommel has published memoirs, and he said this war was a war without hatred. This is what he writes in his African memoirs. And it was already said the Italian government has taken up this heroic war. Miss Meloni 10 years ago already has talked about such a heroic war. You don't even have to know Italian to know what all of that means. Heroico, courageous, dilibitari. Well, these are the images that have been conjured up. Now, the African War, as far as research is concerned, was not a major focus, especially German research didn't focus so much on Africa, but only in recent years there were some new initiatives to research this part of the war. Here we have a French book called The Desert War, La Guerre du Désert, and the German PhD dissertation on colonialism and the racist images of German Wehrmacht soldiers. The North African War, of course, is a very wide historical military topic. I cannot elaborate on all of that, but the starting point was Benito Mussolini, who ever since the 1930s has tried in the north and northeast of Africa to create a kind of comprehensive empire. First of all, he conquered Ethiopia in 1935-36, and then he followed Hitler in the so-called World War. He did not enter the war right away when Hitler wanted him to. He entered the war only when France was on the brink of a defeat in 1940. Only then Mussolini declared war on France and the UK and Britain. And so he tried in Europe and in Africa to carry out a military expansion. And this is what he did on the 30th of September when Italian troops attacked Egypt. Egypt at that point in time, and we are going to hear the real expert from Egypt later on. At that time, Egyptian was a kind of semi-protectorate. It was very much under the influence of the British. And British troops were there in Egypt, were still deployed there to protect the Suez Canal. And the agreement was that in the case of an Italian attack, the British troops would take over defense. These British troops then quickly defeated the Italian attackers in December 1940, February 41, and in that situation, Hitler and the German leadership were afraid that the Italian fascist system would collapse if they lose the war in Africa. And that is why they offered to send German troops to Africa. The so-called famous or infamous African Corps that is still the symbol for Wehrmacht in Africa. But the Afrika Corps was just a smaller unit. The Afrika Corps under Rommel took action very swiftly, and they made sure that they conducted German-Italian offensive in March-April 1941. And you see on the map that the offensives and counter-offensives went on and on. There was this war taking place in the north, and there you see the large distances to be covered during those offenses in November, December 1941. The Allied army started their second offensive to stop the German and Italian advance. And that, of course, then was countered by the German-Italian troops until June 42. The war in Africa had huge dimensions. It was conducted over a length of 2,500 kilometers. And I mean, the distance between Warsaw and Stalingrad, 1,700 kilometers. So the war stretched over a much wider, longer period, longer distance. In July 1942, the German-Italian army tried to break through in the west of Egypt. But they failed. And that was the bloodiest of the 2 or 3 battles that now called the Battles of Alamein. In the beginning of September, there was another offensive in Halfa. Some historians say it was the third or even the third Battle of El Alamein. But no matter how you subdivide the battles, there was a lot of warfare going on. In November 1942, the German offensive had utterly failed, and on the 23rd of October 1942, the large offensive of the Allied forces took place. And that was the offensive that finally decided the war in North Africa. Why did the war find this end? Why did we have this enormous movement of troops? And that war was a war that very much depended on logistics. It was a mobile warfare, mostly waged by tanks and airplanes. But on the other hand, that warfare depended very much on supplies. And the Axis, the German Italians, had to get their supplies from Tripoli over 2,000 kilometers in very difficult terrain. The army of the Axis lost the war because of their poor supplies, their poor logistics. And they also lost the war because they did not gather a lot of reconnaissance about the intentions of the Allied forces. After that battle, the German Italians withdrew from Egypt, and then US, American, and British troops land in the west of North Africa in Algeria and Tunisia, and they exert pressure on the Axis. In 1943, the Axis withdraws from Libya, and the war theater is relocated to Tunisia. But then the new landing troops have a severe defeat, the first time that US forces are being deployed and are being used in the Mediterranean. But 3 months later, the so-called Heeresgruppe Afrika, the German Africa Corps, surrenders near Tunis. That is the classical narration that you get to hear about North Africa. What is missing in that narration is the space and also the societies that lived there. North Africa was a colonial space. Has ever been colonialized ever since the 19th century, some regions much earlier than that. And North Africa was characterized by extreme colonial violence. In the 19th century, France had conquered Algeria in brutal colonial wars. In the 20th century, it was Italy that subjugated Libya. First the liberal Italy, then the fascist Italy that continued its conquests and escalated to a war of extermination. Nicola Labanca says there was a genocide committed by Italy. In Egypt, the situation was somewhat different. For a long time, Egypt had been a British protectorate. In 1922, some of this British domination was overcome during the revolution, but still Britain had a lot of influence on politics. We also must mention Tunisia. That was a French colony, and all French colonies after the defeat of France were handed over to the Vichy government. What we see in all non-African troops is a very widespread racism vis-à-vis the Arab population. Also, the Allied forces had some element of racism, but in the case of fascist forces, there was a very specific racism that went beyond everyday small-scale racism. There you see the attempts of Mussolini to build an empire, especially in 1940. But that phase of imperial expansion was soon over. The second topic that oftentimes gets neglected, especially in Germany, is the fact that it wasn't the Brits that fought the Germans. In those cases, we had multinational, transnational armies. It's true for the Axis army, which was a German, Italian, African army consisting mostly of Italian soldiers. And only in the Battle of Tunis, 1943, the number of German forces was higher than the number of Italian soldiers. The Allied forces were much more complex because they had the Commonwealth units, strong Indian units. The Indian army was involved, and also the British settlements of Australia and New Zealand were involved. And there were also indigenous volunteers, even Maori. There was a Palestine regiment of Jewish and Arab Palestinians that came as volunteers. And there was also a so-called Free French Army, that is to say, an army that was commanded by Charles de Gaulle, and they brought many volunteers from the colonies, from Morocco. You see a Moroccan unit here in the photograph, but also they brought soldiers from Senegal or Chad, sub-Saharan Africa, for short. And Libyan units had been used only at the beginning of the war, but there were many Libyans who stayed on the side of the Allies. They had escaped the Italian colonial rule and fought on the side of the Allied forces. But my colleague is going to say more about the Egyptian army. And so this multinationality was present, and this is also exemplified by the cemeteries that we have in El Alamein and beyond. What is special is that when you compare to Poland and the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, there were not these systematic mass murders, but there also were many violent actions here in North Africa. It had something to do with the fact that it was very much a mobile warfare. After a conquest, many local residents went to support the Allied forces, but some also became collaborators to the fascist forces. Arab residents also went against the Italian settlers when the Allied forces moved in, and there were also massacres against the Arab population. All of that escalated in 1943 in Tunisia. There were many violent acts committed by the Italian army. And the military opponent, the enemy, was treated harshly, as unlike it is being told nowadays. There were also killings in the battlefield. That is to say, soldiers that had surrendered were sometimes just simply killed because they didn't want to take them along. And of course, many prisoners of war were taken in North Africa. Think about the 250,000 Italians and Germans that were involved in the last battle, and they were held captive in 1943. Most of these POWs were treated according to international rules, and that was mostly true for the soldiers that were captured by the Allies. The Italians, however, tried to bring the prisoners of war to Italy, but before taking them to Italy, they had been interned in camps in North Africa, and their conditions were awful, and we had a mortality of 20%. That is to say, after the Soviet prisoners of war, this is the highest mortality we have reported. Also, Allied forces committed war crimes. It was true for all parties involved, and also the situation in the French POW camp was terrible. Then, of course, there was also a lot of violence committed against North African Jews. 450,000 people, if you include Algeria. They had been subjected to restrictive regimes before that, and the Italian colonial power had also imposed the racial laws that they had introduced in their own countries. So they practiced the same in Libya. Algeria and Tunisia were subjected to the Vichy regime. They also had racial laws. A German security command, the so-called Task Force Tunis, was sent by Germany to Libya, and they were sent there, obviously, in order to eradicate the Jews, should they be able to occupy Palestine. But we do have disputes amongst historians, because that task force consisted just of 30 people, and they could never have achieved the total extermination. Then in Tunisia, the Jewish population was terrorized. Here you see Jewish forced laborers in Tunisia, end of 1942, under German-Italian occupation. The Italians have said the Jews will all collaborate with the enemy, and part of the Jewish population was just sent to a concentration camp, the Camp Jado. 2,500 inmates were there, and 500 of them killed because of poor conditions and maltreatment. So it was not a clean war. There were several thousands of people that died. At the end of my statement, I'd like to say something about the significance of Africa. Africa is oftentimes seen as a secondary war theater, but it was very closely linked to the World War in general. First of all, the war in Africa had always been linked with the war in Greece. In both cases, Germany and Italy had fought against the British troops who were also deployed in Greece. And it was a decisive goal of German politics to win against the Brits, both in Africa and in Greece. What we should not forget, and what is hardly ever mentioned in the history of the Second World War, is the fact that at an early stage, Italy suffered a severe defeat in May 1941. They were driven out of Ethiopia. 2,400 prisoners of war were there, much more than a couple of years later in Stalingrad, and the Germans didn't help in that. The African war theater becomes more and more important in 1942. From a regional strategy, it became bigger and bigger to be incorporated into a global strategy in order to erode the power of the Allies. And Germany wanted to get to the Suez Canal. That was Rommel's goal in 1942. And they hoped, could they do that, the UK would leave the war. And there was also one central goal, the war for oil. In summer 1942, they tried to get to Iraq to get to the sources of oil there. At the same time, German forces were supposed to cross the Caucasus Mountains and attack from the north, attack the Middle East from the north. And the goal was always in that operation to get access to the oil, of which Germany and Italy didn't have enough. El Alamein was a turning point in the Second World War, one of three turning points. Of course, it's very similar to the Battle of Stalingrad, November of 1942. The German troops were encircled. And what is less known is the Guadalcanal battle, where the Japanese troops were conquered. Of course, the war in Africa was a decisive element for the Allied forces landing in Europe. We all think about D-Day in France, but the first landing took place in Italy, and that has something to do with Churchill's strategy, who said the soft belly of the Axis will come first. And they thought in Italy, this is the sweet spot or the weak spot of the Axis. And this invasion, the landing in Italy, was a big problem. It took until 1945 to fully conquer Italy. So this landing was not so much of a success, but at any rate, this conquest of Italy led to the toppling of Mussolini. So North Africa was an element in the Italian and German imperialism, and it got a global historical significance in 1942. It was a racist war, a violent war, but it did not include the systematic mass murders that were committed by the Germans in Eastern Europe. And we still have too many national narratives, glorifications, and we need a more comprehensive picture in order to make a meaningful contribution to our culture of remembrance. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. It is not working. Okay, I'll use the microphone. Is it working now?
Yes, because we have the translation in the room. Just speak in the microphone.
Okay. Are you hearing me now? Okay. Good evening, everyone. He's translating. Okay. Yes. So I have to wait. Okay. At the beginning, so you are not listening to me. You are listening to the translation.
Yep, right.
Okay. Okay.
You only can talk once they are talking.
Yes, it's okay. It's okay. At the beginning, I need to express my happiness and my honor to be here with you, and to thank all the associations that participated in this event, Documenta Institute, Max Weber, Oriental Institute in Beirut, and Volksbund, and this museum here. Thank you very much. The first speaker explained many things about the Battle of El Alamein, and this has helped me to specify my speaking about Egypt. The Battle of El Alamein is very important. As you know, it is a turning point in the war, and its result is very important. This was the first main victory in the war. So this was the beginning of the achieving the victory for the Allies. But I am going to speak on only 5 points related to Egypt. I will speak about the first point is the political situation in Egypt before the Battle of El Alamein, and the second is Egypt's attitude towards the war, and the third is the Egyptian army in the war, the role of the Egyptian army, and fourth, I will speak about the British, Commonwealth, German, Italian memorials, and the graves in El Alamein now. And also the new El Alamein, the new city of El Alamein, as a new capital for Egypt. The first point, the political situation in Egypt before El Alamein. Britain was occupied Egypt in 1882. However, it recognized Egypt as a part of the Ottoman Empire. So Britain occupied Egypt, but recognized that Egypt belongs to the Ottoman Empire. This was a very strange situation, but this situation continued until the First World War. In the First World War, the Ottoman Empire announced war against Britain, so Britain announced that Egypt become a British protectorate. From this point, the Egyptians began to struggle against the British occupation, and the revolution of 1919 was the main point in this struggle, in which they achieved independence, not completed independence when Britain announced that Egypt is independent, but still the British army still exists in Egypt. So the Egyptians continue to struggle against the occupation until the international situation began to give signs for the World War. The beginning was in 1936 when Italy occupied Ethiopia, and the Italian forces began in north west of Egypt and the south of Sudan. Egypt and Sudan was one state. So Britain feels that the situation is began more dangerous. So it make a treaty with Egypt in 1936 that Britain recognized the Egyptian independence and will take all its army from all places of Egypt to only the basis of Suez Canal. And despite, while the Egyptian must present every possible assistance to the British army in the case of war. And the war started already after 3 years from this treaty. Actually, the first speaker spoke about the war on the Egyptian front, but he didn't mention Egypt at all. If you heard him, he was talking about the El Alamein, with the Italians and the Germans attacks and retreats, and the British attacks and retreats, and it was a war between the Allies and Axis, between the British and French and British, French, Americans, Australians from one side, the Italians and the Germans from the other side. And Egypt does not exist. This narrative actually appeared in maybe 1946 when let us say, Winston Churchill said in his memoirs about the war, he said, a great part of the Second World War had run its course to defend the land bridge where Africa and Asia meet, to maintain our oil supplies and guard the Suez Canal. So he confesses that this is a great part of the war happened in Egypt. But he says, in the process, the Middle Eastern countries, and notably Egypt, had enjoyed the advantage of protection from German and Italian invasion at no cost. So he says that Egypt paid no cost. But actually, this becomes the traditional narrative of the war, but it is flawed and misleading. It ignores the fundamental political and military, economic, and even social and cultural and psychological, beside the military assistance from Egypt. The assistance of Egypt to the Allied forces was a main reason to achieve the victory. And the victory will not come without the assistance of the Egyptian army and the Egyptian people. This is a huge subject, but I am going to specify specific points to explain how was the Egyptian army participated in the war. When all the camps, according to the Treaty of 1936, Egypt had to assist. One of the assists, all of the camps and barracks of the British forces all over Egypt was built by the Egyptian army. All the defensive lines in Matruh and El Alamein and north of Cairo, all the defensive lines, trenches and fortifications was built by the Egyptian army too. Third, the Egyptian military were placed as front observation units and received the first shock attack when Graziani crossed the border. The Egyptian army was on the borders. When Graziani attacked Egypt, he clashed with the Egyptian army, not the British army. So the Egyptian army made the first attack, and he lose many soldiers and many casualties. Also, during the Rommels campaign, the British forces conducted their fight with their right. You see in the front, the map was here, you saw the map. The Germans were coming from the west, and the British army on the front line, in which the Egyptian army built, as I said, the British army was facing Rommel's campaign, but Rommels used to attack from the south or from the north and circle to surround the British forces. He couldn't do this because of the Egyptian army was in Siwa, and he was protecting the left side of the British army, while the British Navy in the sea was protecting the right side of the British army. So the Egyptian army had a very important role in this point. The Egyptian army also had the task of keeping order in the back lines of the Allied forces when the situation proved difficult in El Alamein. In El Alamein, when the Egyptian army retreated and Britain began to face the Axis forces, the Egyptian army became the back lines of the Allied forces, and he kept the lines of the logistic lines, the railways, and even there were soldiers escaped from the battle. The Egyptian army was arrested them and returned them to the battle. British soldiers were escaping from the battle, but the Egyptian army was behind, and he used to arrest them and return them to the British leadership. The Egyptian ground forces were participating in the war on a daily basis through their resistance to assault planes with the anti-aircraft missiles. The German and Italian aircrafts were attacking Alexandria, Cairo, and also attacking the British bases in the Suez Canal or in everywhere. The Egyptian missiles were fighting against these aircrafts, so they were protect the Egyptian army too. They were not only protect Cairo and Alexandria, they were protecting the British bases too. The Egyptian infantrymen were posted along the canal. Every 200 meters there was a point for observation for the British for the German or Italian aircrafts, they were observe this and alert the Egyptian army, or they notice the bombs that or the mines that they throw it on the canal to protect the sailor on the canal. The Egyptian Navy also participated in the war, since it was protecting all the ports. All the ports of Egypt were working to serve the British Army. So the Egyptian Navy was protecting the ports in which it was working for the British Army. So most of the forces for the British were coming from India, Australia, and New Zealand. They used to come across the Red Sea to the port of Suez or Egyptian ports in general. So the Egyptian Navy was protecting these navies, these ports. Also, the Australian soldiers and New Zealand, all the soldiers that came from the west, from the east, were not trained. So before they participated in the war, or before sending them to the front in El Alamein, they came to Suez, the Egyptian army will train them. So all the soldiers that came from the east trained before they participated in the war by the Egyptian army. The Egyptian military intelligence also collected information on the enemy from the nomadic tribes across the Egyptian-Libyan borders and afforded the Allied forces relevant military information. All the Egyptian intelligence arrested the German and the Italian spies and were collecting information everywhere for the British. The most important role actually came from the Egyptian Royal Air Force. It took part in the war along its British counterpart in defending the areas of the Suez Canal and Cairo. It conducted sorties in the Red Sea to protect the caravans and that carried the supplies from India and South Africa, detecting enemy submarines and controlling air traffic. When the British Air Force encountered a shortage of pilots, their counterparts from the Egyptian Royal Air Force. So after the British achieved the victory in El Alamein, they began to attack in Libya, Tunisia. The Egyptian Air Forces participated to move the British planes to present supplies for the British forces. The British Air Forces handed over the parachute department in the Suez Canal zone to the Egyptian Air Force, who undertook their commission to the best of their abilities. Finally, in a report published by a Major General Keltrick, the head of the military delegation to Egypt in 1945, it is mentioned that in taking over the administration of the air power, the Egyptian army had saved Britain. Thousands of men were deployed elsewhere in the areas. So if we imagine that the British army was about 100,000 soldiers. If you have an army of 100,000 soldiers, you will fight by only 50,000. The other 50,000 will work in logistic works, in covering the sites, on many other administrative and logistic services. But in these cases, in El Alamein, all the British soldiers were fighting, only fighting. The Egyptian army did the other jobs. So this is what he was trying to say. The fourth point in my talk today is about the memorials and the graves. Actually, El Alamein now become a very important place to visit from all the sides of the war, the German, the Italians, the British, and even Australians, New Zealand, Indians, even Moroccan, French. All these countries had dead soldiers that burned there. So Egypt gave most of these countries land to build memorials and to make the graves for their soldiers. The first was the British memorial, or not the British, it's for the Commonwealth or the Allies. This memorial was established in October 1954. It contains 11,000 graves, about 11,000 graves. Then we have the Italian one also. I think it's founded in 1957. Also, the German memorial, in which you saw its photo on this screen. This was established in 1959 on a high hill and buried in about 4,000 graves. There is also a Greek memorial for about 200 Greek warriors. So they used to come, the families of the dead soldiers or the governments used to come and celebrate. At the beginning, they will celebrate in different occasions. The German in a side, the British in another side. But starting from 2004, they began to collect together and to celebrate for this occasion. They become they are not enemy anymore. And now El Alamein has become a very important city for Egypt. It's become tourist city. And they build another Alamein, the new El Alamein, from the old El Alamein. It becomes the second capital of Egypt, or the summer capital of Egypt, since its weather is better than in Cairo. So the government used to move to El Alamein in the summer. The El Alamein became the capital that governed Egypt from this place. All the summer, the president, the government, the prime minister, and all the ministers live in El Alamein during the summer. So El Alamein has a very important future, and one of its importance is these memorials and graves for the Allied forces and the Axis forces. Thank you very much. Thank you. The translation for the questions.
Also for the
Thank you. I hear nothing.
PowerPoint.
Good evening, I'm Christian Fuhrmeister, and I'm very happy to be able to try out how it works, to give an online presentation, to store that info. But right away I would like to share my screen with you, my PowerPoint presentation. You see my slides, and we will go to the beginning of my presentation. This presentation of mine will be a supplement to the other two presentations by Dieter, Paul, and Professor Hilal. I would like to add a perspective, the perspective of art, history, and architecture. My title is Strategic Memorial Architecture for the Federal Republic of Germany, the War Cemetery of El Alamein. It's not a new topic for me. In my brief presentation, I would like to try and show to you what you can find in buildings if you want to analyze contemporary historical sentiments. You see a bird's eye view, an aerial photograph from Google Maps. You see the war cemetery here, right here in the middle. It is being surrounded more and more by a motorway, access roads, various clubs, a congress center, and many other edifices, many other buildings. Now, is that a natural development or is that a problem, and what does it mean? This is what I would like to focus on and give you some information. For me, it all started in the 1990s when I started working together with the German War Graves Committee. In 2014, I had a meeting together with the Kai couple. We had an event, a two-day event, the first day in Berlin and the other day in Munich. 3 years later, we published online the summary of that conference in Riha. It's an online journal, and we had our special issue, the War Graves, the Soldier Cemetery 1940 to 1988 as a construction task. You will find that that edition of the journal is free of charge. You can always find it online. Kai Kappel asks the question, how about the war cemeteries of Tobruk and El Alamein? Are they seen as a strategic memorial architecture for Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany? So this is a question that has a lot to do with the topic of tonight's event. Let me just paraphrase what Kai Kappel wrote about it. All of what he wrote is still valid, and I do not need to sort of say this is obsolete and we have new findings. No, what is written there in the journal is still the valid state of research. You can check it for yourself. Riha Journal is an open access journal and has always been an open access journal ever since it was founded. I am not a specialist in architectural history. I am a specialist for art history. And here we have breaks and continuities, a series of articles that you can also access online if you want to get more information about this topic. And of course, we are at the Documenta Institute, and you can of course use the Documenta archive. Documenta and Werner Haftmann have a lot of publications. Now let's delve into the topic. It was in 1961 when a journal was published by Volksbund, that is to say, the German War Graves Commission. We see the cover on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side of my slide you see a page with illustrations. It shows the two war memorials, Tobruk and El Alamein. In German they are called Totenburg, which means Castle of the Dead or Cenotaph. The journal is a very big one in a folio format. Let's show it to you briefly. This is the journal. And I'd like to go through some of the pages of that journal dating back to 61 with you. I'd like to confront you with a few observations about commemoration of the dead and collective graves. In North Africa, we all know there were many battles taking place in the Second World War. We heard about it. There were many people that were killed, and they were usually buried together. And those cemeteries were then surrounded by buildings that we would call as a fortress. But linked to that, we also have narratives, history constructions, and this also has something to do with the political way of interpreting the past. I myself I've also used the concept that is used by Kai Kappel, not regarding Africa, but Bitui and Quiro, that these are two battlefields in North Macedonia and Italy. And I have raised the question, those sort of fortress-like buildings, could they be seen monumental architecture? I wrote an essay about that, and it's available online. So these fortress-like war cemeteries, could they have meant to be of military function? Could they be seen as military strategic architecture? In this essay of mine, I'm saying at the end, the cenotaphs or the memorials of the 1930s have a military added value. Tischler has a similar building that he designed in Upper Silesia that is also a fortress-like defense structure. You can look at this article, this essay of mine, in the journal. So that much about memorial architecture as a technical term. Let me go back to the brochure, the journal of 1961. That journal has this photograph, and there you see an arrow. It's important to note this arrow, because it marks the very place where later the Totenburg was erected. It shows you how wide the landscape is. It's a very flat landscape, very close to the seashore, very stony, not much or nearly no vegetation at all. So it's a kind of change between a desert-like landscape and then you see all of a sudden this monumental building. You have a nothing here with an arrow on, and all of a sudden then you have a nothing surrounded by a wall, a war cemetery to hold the bodies of those soldiers that were exhumed and later reburied there. And that is why I've said it's a fortress-like memorial architecture. You have a very small entrance, basically too small for such a big structure. And one could say, okay, one door can be defended easily. You all go in one by one, and you can always defend. Here, this again is an excerpt from the journal 1961, the technical data of El Alamein and the cross-section. There you see the volumes, the information when construction was started, 1956, inauguration 59, 3 shifts per day. And you also see the parties involved and the dimensions of this structure. the stone used comes from the region itself, from a quarry 145 kilometers away from El Alamein. It's a porphyr, red porphyr, and obelisk made of basalt lava coming from Germany. And that also means they took that stone from Germany, transported it to Africa to say this is a home away from home. So this memorial El Alamein, as you know, reminds a number of medieval castles, in particular a castle in Apulian, southern Italy, of the Staufer area, the Castel del Monte. Kai Kappel has compared the two structures, and Kai Kappel has written an analysis in 2017, and he says at the end of this analysis, it is necessary to comment this architectural language, to put it in a context, because one cannot simply continue such an architectural language, because it's a language that harks back to the National Socialist period. That is to say, this architectural language comes from the horizon of the SS, from the right-wing conservative and folkish attitude. All of that was published, and I would like to explain one more thing to you. Here on the left-hand side, upper side, you see the design of Castel del Monte, and down in the middle you see El Alamein. And in the brochure of 1961, it is clearly said that this El Alamein structure is intentionally modeled after the old castles. But here I would like to say it is also a design that remembers the great plans, the great deeds and ultimate failures. Here they have tried to verbalize the Second World War and the memory of the dead. And sometimes it seems as if they were desperate, looking for a way to sort of say it correctly. Like say, if El Alamein, if Castel del Monte and El Alamein are symbols of the great plans, the glorious deeds and ultimate failure, then we see really the limits of analogies. I mean, if you look at the Second World War, what would be the great plan? Who made this great plan? Who committed glorious deeds? And does that really mean that the German Wehrmacht failed like the Staufer dynasty? Very strange verbal constructs I would like to emphasize. And here I like to come back to our present day. What is happening here? And what is happening today is also the reason why Mr. Wirtz has invited you all to attend this symposium. This view is, in a way, in a precarious situation or even endangered. Let me quote from a text that Kai Kappel and me have written fairly recently, at the end of 2022. And that text is about the status quo of this structure. Should it be preserved or not? There is a void around it, a void in the middle of which you have this structure, this cemetery. Let me read this text. It's half a page, and that will be, this quote will be the end of my presentation. Couple Christian Vormeister, I quote, regardless of the fact that the concept of the Totenburg, the cenotaph, designed by Volksbund architect Robert Tischler, the inauguration in 1959 is a highly problematic solution as a place of remembrance. The specific concept should nevertheless be preserved as far as possible. The idea of the Totenburg, which was developed in the late 1920s, took on a more concrete ideological form under National Socialism. Heroic commemoration, eternal vigil, and the Reich far from its borders, fusion with National Socialist ideas of soldiership, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, this political interpretation of the past and the targeted instrumentalization of the soldier's death is, precisely because of its particularity, predestined to be used as a place of learning today. The trend that has been begun to supplement German war cemeteries and other burial sites, such as Quero and Podol, with information programs like 19 for 19, that was one of the series of events organized by the German War Graves Commission. This should be continued at El Alamein in order to make it possible to conduct political and historical transnational education. Here, the German War Graves Commission has responsibility. It is essentially a matter of actively promoting critical reflection on the castle-like war cemeteries by means of the largely unaltered building fabric and a contemporary information program. The historical concept of the Totenburg, castle as shelter, refuge, memorial architecture. We heard about the memorial architecture. This concept necessarily presupposes that there is an absolute difference between the inside and the outside, the open space and the walled-in space. This contrast is of elementary importance and should not be watered down or relativized. The open space of desert and sand that you see in this photograph is essential for today's perception of the castle. Namely, that there is something that is nothing and is very important at the same time. This closes my presentation. I thank you for your attention, and I will be at your disposal if you have questions.
Thank you, Mr. Vormeister. I can see you on the screen. You're joining us online, and I would like to also thank the two speakers sitting next to me on stage. So you have realized that we have different approaches or accesses, the military history, the blank spots in military history, and also Professor Hilal's speech, which was referring to the Egyptian side, which is often overlooked or simply ignored in our historiography. Tonight, we focus on memory culture, and I would like to come back to this dimension also on the basis of your presentation. I would like to also thank you, Mr. Vormeister and Mr. Kappel, because you've been dealing with the architecture of the memorial, and also you referred to the contradictions within associations like the Volksbund, because all this refers to the question, how do we deal with controversial histories or narratives? We remembered Mr. Tischler, who worked there between 1923 and 59, and We also heard about the formal language and the structures of the monuments. We do find memorials today, and Mr. Fuhrmeister and Mr. Kappel offer an important perspective which helps to comment and which also helps to contextualize the not always simple activity of remembrance. On the one hand, we do have family members who suffered losses, who are in pain, and who thus visit places like Alamein. On the other hand, there is not a really clear distancing with respect to the historiography of the 1960s, which furthermore focused on the hero stories and which used a language which is still difficult. So we are also dealing with a critical assessment of the blank spots in history and historiography. And I have a question for all of you, because we do have the logic of the heroic historical narrative, and the question is, how can we develop counter-narratives? How can we recognize other realities? Those affected by Nazi and war crimes, for example, are first and foremost subjects, but they are also players, acting persons. They tell us about life and about fighting, dying, and mourning. So how do we deal with this difficult legacy, with these particular narratives? And what about the German memory culture today? What exclusions are perpetuated by memory politics today? And what is possibly changing these days? Maybe those of you who are here have an advantage and you might want to start, but Mr. Vormeister will certainly get the word as well. I'm happy to listen to my colleagues and then I will take the floor. Right, so I will begin. Now, this is a marginal topic, actually, because when talking about war, crime, and memory culture, we tend to focus on the Soviet Union and the Russia campaign, which is very evident these days, i.e., and that's what I tried to say. I mean, everybody knows Rommel, right? Rommel is an icon. And people have ideas when hearing his name, the tragedy of the general who had to commit suicide in resistance and all these things. So basically, it's important to also take this topic into the overall and a general memory culture, which is also a subject matter when we talk with our partners in other countries. So it would be good to take this on board to see the dimension, right? And secondly, we have to offer a somewhat discrete post-colonial approach. I mean, I'm saying discrete because I'm not really a friend of the post-colonial approach, but this is about an awareness, because we are not dealing with a vacuum, with a void, with an empty space. But we're dealing with societies that are very different in their experiences. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, they all have very different experiences. And we have to see them all. And I think it makes sense to embark on a dialogue, which is what we are doing today. However, we should not focus that much on military history according to the question, what went wrong for the Germans, but what did it and what does it mean for the people there? I mean, it has disappeared a bit from the agenda in Germany, which is also due to the fact that we are the fourth or fifth generation. Maybe you know Bracher. He was, so to speak, the Nestor of German contemporary history. He was captured in Tunisia. He went to America. He became a Democrat. But actually, we don't have the grandpa anymore who fought in the war, so there is no link, no real connection anymore. And this is certainly also a task of memory policy. It has to be written, memory policy, and it's also important that we see the differences in the approaches, because the Commonwealth's memory in Great Britain or in the UK is very different from what we have here. So Maori memories are part of it. In Germany, it's different. Germany was not a colonial power, and thus has not brought that many colonial discourses. Italy, again, is different. And if you look at what the Ministry of Defense says there, I mean, with respect to the awareness of the colonial war which was waged. So this is, again, a different discourse. The Italian discourse is, again, different from the British or the German one. And then what about memory culture in our society? We are trying to establish links, and this is difficult also because I assume that in North Africa we have a kind of a rupture in the process of remembering, whereas Germany sees itself as a kind of a champion of memory. And then, of course, there's the question, what does it mean to be a soldier as such? I mean, we are in a post-heroic time. The Wehrmacht is actually like a crime. But if you look beyond Germany, for example, at Great Britain, you see a different continuity. So waging the good war is a very different idea there, and there is also a consensus. If you go to a bookstore in London, you find about 10% affirmative books, and Italy, I mean, that's the same. Nicola Labanca is one who is called a person who is blaming his own family all the time. But there are few others. So I do see difficulties in terms of bringing the social dimension into the transnational one. But it's good to undertake initiatives and do it.
Okay. Well, as you know, the Victorian write the history. So these narratives we know, or we read in the hundreds of volumes about the war written by the Victorians. Until now, maybe the German historians didn't say their word until now, and the Egyptian, the other world. But I think it's time to say our word. The Egyptian, the Algerian, Tunisian, Libyan historians, and the other countries in the third world that participated in the war. It was not a European war. It was a world war. And all the countries that participated can now has the chance to say its word. In Egypt, depending on a local archive, I found that Egypt participated clearly in this war, but as I told, they ignored its role. This is because, you know, Egypt, at the beginning of the war, Egypt has three choices when the war started. To participate beside the German and the Italian forces for its independence. Egypt was struggling against the British for its independence. So the chance had come, we can fought with the Axis forces to get rid of the British. This is one choice. The second choice is to participate with the British and negotiate with them before participating that you will give us the independence and we will help you in the war. The third choice was not to participate with the British, the Allies, or the Axis. Actually, Egypt chose no one of these three choices. Egypt announced that it's a neutral power or neutral side in this war, but participated in the war. So this is why the Egyptian rule is not clear. But again, according to the treaty of the 1936, Egyptians participated strongly in this war, as I described. Also, I think there are red lines for the Axis powers, at least, or Germany at least. They cannot discuss specific points. For example, I noticed that I was working with Saudi television. We are preparing a program titled Heritage Earth. In Arabic, Earth, it means heritage. And this program, they used to deal with the Saudi history related with the West. And in one of these episodes in the program, we prepared an episode about a German doctor, medicine. He was an officer in the German army. The British captured him in El Alamein or after El Alamein, and they imprisoned him in Ismailia in Egypt, the British camp in Ismailia. He escaped from the camp, and he disappeared in the eastern desert in Egypt with the Bedouin nomads in the Sahara of Egypt. Then he stayed with the Bedouins about 3 years after the war, from 1945 to 1948. Then he participated in the Palestinian war beside the Egyptian forces. He was fighting beside Egypt against the Israeli forces. After the defeat of the Egyptian forces, he escaped to Lebanon. He lived in Lebanon with no name and with no papers. Worked as a doctor in a hospital. Then he traveled to Saudi Arabia and worked as a doctor in the eastern region of Saudi Arabia for about 4 years. Then he returned to Beirut and lived there, in which he connected with the German embassy and returned his name and his paper and come back to Germany, but he didn't like to live in Germany. He returned to Beirut and stayed there until he died. Before he died, he wrote his memories. You, the Germans, know nothing about this man. And there are hundreds of stories like this story. It's not covered. As you know, the Western media dealing with the British and the American prisoners in the German camps and describe them as heroes when they escaped from the German prisons or when they did any actions at these prisons. But I don't know why you don't deal with this. Maybe you cannot describe, I can describe Herbert Bretska. His name is Herbert Bretska, the doctor officer who escaped from the British prison. I describe him as a hero, but you cannot describe him as a hero since he was fighting with the Nazis, and maybe there are it's a sensitive point. So I think this time is past, and now we want to deal in academic way with the war and with the situation in general. So we need, this place is not, I think, where are the German universities, the Department of History in the German universities? And I connected with many German historians, asked them about such a person. They know nothing about him. So I think the time is come to reconsider the one who to stop the Victorian to write the history. We need to rewrite the history from our point of view. Okay, thank
you. Would you like to say something about the question now? I can give you another one if you want me to. No, it's all right, Ms. Gomez. I can follow up on what Professor Hilal said. Research about unknown, undiscovered stories and history. This is indeed important. What I have noticed while I was listening, Mr. Pohl just said we are in the 5th or 4th generation after the war. So we have these time layers, temporal layers, understanding these temporal layers, and also thinking about those who have come behind the events. How can we develop identity on the basis of certain narratives of the past that we derive from the past? You just talked, Professor Hilal, about the literature or history written by the victorious power. And of course, we do have the opposite of that as well, the literature written by those defeated. And we have these soldiers' novels. And we are talking over and above about survivors of historical and military events. I am very much in charge of objects, architecture. One can do that, but we also need the context. Whatever the object is, you need to put that object in a context. And when we look at the context, we will also have to think about the semantics. What are the concepts and terms that I use in order to remember something, in order to configure something? Tonight I'm in Italy, and immediately I think of the war monuments in Italy. And the inscription is Caduti, First World War. But then there is a second category of people remembered per la conquista del imperio, for the conquest of the empire, the fascist empire of Mussolini. And here we talk about the years 34 to 36, the expansion, wars, the wars of conquest. That is to say, in the general public memory, we still have this alive. It is inconceivable in Germany to have some memorials in public spaces which say we commemorate those who have tried to conquer and defend our empire. I'm just saying it is a task now of society in the 21st century, that is to say the year 2024, to put things in a context, do it critically, link it with a permanent re-evaluation and re-establishment of perspectives. It is, of course, difficult, and it's a very cumbersome, difficult task, because for that we need other frames of reference. We need a new frame of reference in order to develop a new picture, not just through the national lens. We have to have the bigger picture of something like the Second World War that is not just seen through the national lens. And I think that is an ongoing task, an eternal task, as the colleague from the Hesse Center for Civic Education said in his welcome speech. And I think today we were reminded of the need to develop this wider perspective. Thank you. I have to look at my watch. There's not much time that we have left. But let me ask you one more question. And then I also would like to hand over to our audience. Maybe there is a question from our audience as well. The three of you have emphasized in very different ways the fact that we are in the fifth generation with hardly any person surviving those events. And you have also emphasized that we need to put ourselves in the shoes of those who've survived it, not just concerning this as dead knowledge we do not need anymore. We need to keep this memory alive as a living, as a vivid memory. And Mr. Fuhrmeister, you've said it again, El Alamein could be a vibrant place for learning in a transnational context. Mr. Paul, Mr. Hilal, you have also emphasized that, because it's not just a German place of remembrance, it's a complex, it's a plural place of remembrance with many different memories, dissonances. How could such a commemoration work look like concretely in El Alamein? You, Mr. Kappel, have said that the development of this architecture, of course, was done in a difficult period. Maybe it's problematic. But how can we use these buildings, use all the contradictions that we see, that in order to create in El Alamein a living memorial place, a place for learning that gives participation to everyone, also those who are not mentioned in official historiography? Can we use aesthetic processes and processes of remembrance in order to reach those who have no more relatives that have been there during the actual events? All right, let me start. We must be honest, we must be transparent. We need to put the facts and data on the table. We also need to expose the narratives that are not correct, and we need to have a discourse about those narratives. We need to talk to one another, all coming from our own perspectives, of course. What we really need is a discourse. That is not a work you can do at your desk. You need a multinational setting and a discourse. And of course, the major challenge is we need to have a transgenerational discourse. We have different people coming from different times and different perspectives. And of course, we need partners that can provide the institutional framework. Otherwise, we will have no continuity. We need this framework. We need this platform to rely on. What will happen then? Well, I think we must be courageous enough to provide that platform as an open platform for everyone. Let me talk about concrete and precise things. I think we have to go beyond the mere battle. This is what we do also in the other war cemeteries. We do not see them as an isolated event. We have to put it in a context about the imperial attempts, and then I think we cannot and should not only focus on the German memorial. As far as I know, there are 10 different memorials there. They all have to be seen in a context. The other memorials are not as huge, as big. I have no problem with the German monument. It has to be interpreted from a historical perspective. We cannot demolish that nowadays. It must stand as it is. But we have to go beyond that one memorial, create the connection. Haven't been there, but I've seen the fortress in pictures. It really is a kind of fortress-like big structure. And the meaning, of course, is the multinational killing. And so we need to focus on the multinationality. We need to also talk about the country where it took place, about the population that lived between El Alamein and the western border, and how these people, local people, have experienced the war. Of course, a learning place like this is very far away. And of course, it's a touristic place, and oftentimes people travel there and see all of that just as a tourist site. So it's a bit difficult to conduct commemoration and learning activities so far away. Would you like to add something?
Yes, in general, in the Western media and even in the academia in America and Britain, France, they used to describe the German army as a devil. Actually, in wars, there is no devils and angels. All parts are devils. Those who started the war are devils, and those who ended the war by nuclear bombing on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are devils. Those who killed or bombed or destroyed Berlin, or those who destroyed London by Air Force attacks, those all are devils. So now we want to leave this stories to the historians to say their word, depending on the archives. I think we have enough archives. I worked on the British archive, in which I find stories that never told, like that the British were planning to cut the dams in Egypt and to flood all the delta to prevent the German army to arrive to Suez Canal. This means that maybe millions of Egyptians will be suffer from the floods. This is one example, and there are many other stories like this. We need to cover it. We need to tell it to the people. So I think the time have come for this.
Let me contradict my colleague a little bit, Because, of course, as far as warfare is concerned, of course, we have also violations of war. Like Chiang Kai-shek flooded in China deltas and drowned his own population. But let me also look at the German and Italian racist point of view. The Second World War is a different war compared to the other wars. It's very much different from the First World War, where we have had a certain equidistance. In the Second World War, we have a huge framework that goes beyond the normal violation of international law in a war. We went beyond that. We do not have much time left, but let's hand over to our audience. Is there anyone who has a question? Those who raises the hand first can have the first question. Mr. Reier, you were very quick in raising your hand. I'm Thomas Reier from the War Graves Commission. First of all, I also would like to thank all our colleagues. My question goes to Professor Hilal. What I would like to know is culture of remembrance in Germany is a topic that we are discussing a lot in Germany. How about Egypt? When you ask the man in the street, what do you know about El Alamein? What would normal people tell you in Egypt? Do they discuss it? Do they have information about it? How many people are interested in that topic? I mean, not the academia, the standard, the normal people. Can we have a brief answer? And maybe a second question just to follow up. Egyptians during the war, 80% of the Egyptians were on the German side. Many Egyptians just wanted to be neutral, and only a small part wanted to support the British. If you ask the Egyptian people today, they would say Marshal Rommel is more popular than the British. The later president of Egypt, Sadat, was an officer at the time, and he collected information, and he wanted to hand over that information to the Germans. Unfortunately, his plane was shot down because the Germans didn't know that this Egyptian plane would be a friendly plane. The Egyptians are suffering from that. Thousands of mines are still there, and many people were injured by mines. And I am myself from Egypt, and I hope very much that Germany, Italy, and the UK will make sure that the remaining mines will be removed. We have talked about El Alamein and what do Egyptians know about El Alamein. And at the time, they wanted the Germans to win. Sorry, one more thing before you hand over. The Egyptians today hope that El Alamein will be a place with a peace museum, so that one can get together, remember, and talk about peace in the world, and especially in the Middle East. Thank you.
Okay. Actually, the Egyptian attitude towards the battle at the beginning of the World War itself, not El Alamein, when the German achieved many victories, the public opinion in Egypt began to discuss the first option or the first choice that I mentioned, that if we stand beside Germany, we may achieve our independence. And even the king Farouk of Egypt, began to think about this option. Some demonstrators began to say, to appeal Rommel to come, El Alamein ya Rommel, or they said, go ahead, Rommel. But actually, this was for a short time and achieved nothing. The British media began to explain for the Egyptians that Germany, if you stand with Germany, you will get rid from a colonial power that may be merciful to the devil itself. The German army will destroy everything, and you will suffer from the German as a colonial power. It's different colonial power. So, and they pressured on the king himself. They threatened the king. They will get rid of him if he didn't assign Nahas Pasha, the prime minister of the Wafd party, it's a liberal party, to be the prime minister. And the king had to agree, and he assigned him as the prime minister of Egypt, and Nahas Pasha as a democratic man and liberal, a leader of the liberal party, found that the British forces, it's a liberal state, and he used to fight against the dictatorship of the King Farouk. So he will not replace a dictatorship by another dictatorship. So he found that Egypt must stand beside Britain, and this is what happened. He presented all possible assistance to the British army in different sides. I wrote a paper, it's very famous, published in Brill, in Leiden, about, as Dr. Liliana said, it's titled Egypt's overlooked contribution to World War II. So I described in this paper, it's about 40 pages, described all sides of assistance that Egypt, even the economy, the political assistance. Egypt participated in the war, but didn't announce the war against Germany because the British found that this situation is good. Egypt can import goods for the British army, but since it didn't declare war against Germany, the German will not attack the Egyptian ships across the seas. So this was good for the British. Anyway, Nahas Pasha was expecting that Britain will confess this Egyptian rule and will discuss the question of independence of Egypt after the war. But what happened is the opposite. The British get rid of Nahas Pasha and supported the dictatorship of the king to get rid of him.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hillel, Mr. Pohl, Mr. Fuhlmeister. Thank you very much, dear audience. This is the end of this event, and have a good evening.
Thank you.